Every moment in business happens only once. The next Bill Gates will not build an operating system. The next Larry Page or Sergey Brin won't make a search engine. And the next Mark Zuckerberg won't create a social network. If you are copying these guys, you aren't learning from them. Of course, it's easier to copy a model than to make something new. Doing what we already know how to do takes the world from 1 to n, adding more of something familiar. But every time we create something new, we go from 0 to 1. The act of creation is singular, as is the moment of creation, and the result is something fresh and strange. Unless they invest in the difficult task of creating new things, American companies will fail in the future, no matter how big their profits remain today. What happens when we've gained everything to be had from fine-tuning the old lines of business that we inherited? Unlikely as it sounds, the answer threatens to be far worse than the crisis of 2008. Today's best practices lead to dead ends. The best paths are new and untried. In a world of gigantic administrative bureaucracies, both public and private, searching for a new path might seem like hoping for a miracle. But actually, if American businesses is going to succeed, we are going to need hundreds or even thousands of these miracles. This would be depressing, but for one crucial fact. Humans are distinguished from other species by our ability to work miracles. And these miracles are called technology. That was an excerpt from investor Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1. And on this episode of the 3 Bucket Podcast, we have with us someone who is using the power of these miracles to change our society. Jake Adler is the CEO and founder of Ordy, an AI chatbot that provides advice for investing in cryptocurrencies, soon looking to expand the company in the transactional space with the introduction of a crypto wallet. He's also built Grader, a software that helps teachers better grade their students' work, and is currently delving deep into the blockchain space. We've also worked together a lot of times in the past on a nuclear energy project called Atherma. Honestly, if there's anyone that you could go to create the miracles that are technology, it's him. So yeah, Jake, glad to have you on.
Of course. It's a pleasure being on the 3 Bucket Podcast. I've been listening to all the prior ones too. I really like the one with Evan. Evan's a close friend of mine as well. So I mean, lots of the technology we see today is very miraculous. I forget who specifically said it, but they mentioned that technology, or at least good technology, should almost seem the same as magic. Something that's so miraculously flush that it's almost so challenging to see what's really behind the screen. So, I mean, in terms of technology, it's a really critical topic for a lot of people today, and it's really been one of the most defining innovations within the last few centuries, whether that be with just even scientific knowledge applying upon engineering practices has been something that we've seen for hundreds of years now. So, very interesting topic, and I would love to talk about it with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like on the Atherma project, for example, it's kind of crazy how if you apply technology in the right way, depending on like the scope and scale of your problem, you can basically come up with crazy solutions. Like for Atherma, we were creating a thermonuclear electric reactor. It's like crazy.
Yeah.
Actually, do you want to go deeper into that?
Yeah, for sure. So considering the fact that none of us have any university degrees on nuclear physics or even electrical, anything relating to electricity or engineering, we, a group of 4, me, Didi and I included, were able to develop a small modular reactor. It was a thermoelectric small modular reactor solution, which basically captures the heat energy directly from the reactor core and transfers that using what's known as the Seebeck effect into electrical energy that can be applied today. And the biggest significance of that specific moonshot solution was the fact that thermal energy is rather inefficient. Like the fact is that the current process involves water turning into steam and that steam turning a turbine, and that process just doesn't make sense at all. Like you could vastly improve that process. So we worked on that together. And that was for the group that we're part of. And yeah, I think we won the competition, right? It was like a moonshot type of competition, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, I remember we were after like we won that competition, we kind of posted it on a couple of forums, and it was pretty cool to see how many different opinions and viewpoints were coming on the same technology. Like I think one post was about how the thermoelectric couples that we were using wouldn't actually work because of neutron flux or something like that. So the neutrons would actually like degrade the efficiency of the conversion, even if it was more efficient at one point in time. So the efficiency would kind of go down over a period of 10 years, which is a problem because in the energy industry, you need consistent energy for a long period of time.
I mean, I like I said, none of us are truly nuclear scientists, but the neutron flux was something we did not consider. And you nailed it. It's when I think it's when you're right. I think it's when the neutrons really degrade the technology, which would have been a large problem considering that the thermoelectric semiconductor, which is what we were going to wrap around the reactor core, was like the most critical part of the technology that we were developing on. But it was really interesting because I actually had an opportunity to discuss with a colleague after we worked on the project, and somebody who's kind of in tune with what's happening on the like institutional like university landscape. And I actually got word that MIT and the Biden administration was actually working on a very similar project using these. Yeah, I feel like I mentioned this to you. They were working on the same project. They were just doing a different effect. Like I don't know if they were using the Seebeck effect, which is the thermoelectric effect, but they were using something similar. But it was a thermoelectric nuclear. It wasn't a nuclear generator. They were trying to capture thermoelectric geothermal energy. Yeah. So basically, trying to take the heat from the earth and turn it into electrical energy in a more efficient manner. Yeah. Because I think geothermal works very similarly, which is heating water. But don't hold me on that because we didn't look at geothermal energy, so I don't want to be an expert there. But yeah, I mean that project was, I think it was a really incredible project for a lot of reasons. But yeah, I think you're definitely right. It really shows how when technology is applied in the right context, you can really reach very far depths like very quickly. And I think you were the one of the people who was leading that project. Like you were at the head of the boat, you were the captain there. So that was a really awesome project to work with you on.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, 100% agree with that. Like it's also a matter of, I think we were struggling for the first 2 weeks to come up with an idea for that kind of project, and only in the last 2 days like did we really understand, okay, this is actually what we're going to end up doing. And that's something that's really interesting is that like in the book that Pastor said I was just reading, Peter Thiel often mentions this idea of going from 0 to 1 in any space, right? Like actually innovating. And it's crazy how when you look for innovations, it's like they don't exist almost. Like if you try to find a world-changing idea, you'll never find one. But the second you step back and like let your brain like connect the dots behind the scenes, it appears as if there's like unlimited innovations, just like from my personal observation.
Yeah, 0 to 1 is actually one of my all-time favorite books. I read that a few years ago. Yeah. Peter Thiel is an absolute genius. But in terms of innovations and going from that 0 to 1, so really that vertical progress instead of that continuous horizontal, I really think kind of on the topic of technology, we saw a lot of horizontal progress for a long time. Like we had people innovating upon the same ideas. We saw little spurts of vertical innovation with these incredible minds and geniuses throughout history. But we truly never had this consistent vertical growth. And I definitely agree with you. I think that most people, especially when they're entering the world of innovation and they're trying to create that impact or trying to discover something new, they look so deep that they can't actually kind of step back and see where the dots really need to go and where we really need to begin to move with technology. And I think that is a critical moment. But touching a little bit back on vertical progress instead of horizontal, I wanted to highlight or at least discuss this thing with you on the podcast when you invited me, which is the moment I truly believe we started moving more towards that vertical progress. So around, I don't have a timestamp, but definitely a few centuries ago, humans were essentially capable of producing enough food for an entire society. Because if you kind of look at human history, it would be them basically making enough food just to survive. But once they were able to make enough food for them to flourish, we saw people actually moving more towards this vertical progress. They had the ability to actually innovate upon what was broken already in society. And that was such a critical moment. And I could argue it's as critical as the moment we discovered fire, because that was the true moment that people actually began to innovate and create that vertical progress in society that we never saw before. Like that was the turning stone. And I think, I don't know if it was Yuval Noah Harari who mentioned that in Homo Sapiens, I think, not Homo Deus, but it was one of the two books where he kind of discusses even when we move towards creating enough products like enough goods to allow all of humanity to flourish. And it's really interesting to think about that as well. But I think in terms of technology, in terms of innovation, that was one of the main cornerstones, one of the main pillars that allowed us to kind of even get to where we are today. And I think that's something that's truly interesting, because that was a long time ago and we're seeing a lot of innovation happening since then. So I just thought that was a really interesting thing to bring up, and I wanted to hear maybe potentially if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think logically speaking, it makes sense, right? If you can produce enough resources for a society, enough food, then for once, the people living in that society have the ability to take their head out of like, oh, what am I going to eat tomorrow, etc., and actually focus on the continued alleviation of suffering, right? Which is technically what innovation is aiming to solve. Like, if you look at the rapid pace of innovation between the 1900s and 1960, roughly, right? We basically learned how to fly and go to the moon in the span of 60 years, which, like, I don't think many people truly understand the scope of that. Like, in less than a century, we managed to travel to space. Right, and it's partially because what you were saying, like we were able to produce enough resources for a society so that they could focus on something different, so that they could focus on living productive and meaningful lives as opposed to simply, scavenging for resources 24/7.
For sure. I think that period, like the 1900s to 1960, was a very big contextual period for technology.
Yeah.
And I think context is vastly significant for technology, because I'll explain the 1900 one first, and I'll tell you a more recent example. But during the 1900s, even upwards to the 1960s, well, all the way to the 1990s, we had this Soviet Union I don't know if it was so early as the 1900s, but it was definitely around the 1960s for sure. So with the space race, right, America was challenged. They had pressure on them to complete a rocket ship that was capable of traveling to the stars, traveling to the moon. So I think the context there was pretty significant. If you look at today, software like Zoom, Google Meet, this software wouldn't have seen so much innovation, so much advancement if it wasn't for the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Like the last 2 years alone have allowed Zoom and all these work from home technologies, as well as technologies that have supported workers and supported individuals during COVID, to advance significantly farther than they would if COVID was never around. So I think the context is vastly important. And connecting that even to what I do, for example, with Ordy, if cryptocurrency wasn't, or for example, if people weren't so concerned about inflation, people weren't so concerned about the value of the dollar decreasing in terms of the relative value of the other currencies around the world, then there wouldn't be so much popularity driven towards cryptocurrency, and I wouldn't have seen such a big motivation to try and support new people, new investors trying to invest in cryptocurrency. So I think context is also something that's truly vastly significant when it comes to the advancements in certain industries as opposed to those that aren't advanced upon.
Agreed. Especially because it's interesting, because throughout history, politics and science have like almost a hand-in-hand relationship with one another. Like, I think Yuval Noah Harari discusses this in Homo Deus too. He basically talks about how, like, for example, Charles Darwin, right, like the main evolutionary biologist, he essentially, I think, boarded, like, don't quote me on this because I don't fully remember the story, but it was something like, I think one of the governments, it was in Europe, one of the European governments was sending a ship for conquest, somewhere in the South Pacific, I think, I'm not 100% sure on that, but the idea was that they wanted to explore new lands and conquer them, right? So Darwin ended up becoming an assistant on one of those ships, and the entire reason we have the evolutionary theory is because he was just an assistant on a conquest, which is just crazy, right?
Yeah. I know Darwin did travel around a lot. That's how he was able to examine and understand all species. I don't know about that. I actually didn't have an opportunity to read Homo Deus, but if that story is true, then I mean, definitely one of those miracles that are out there. Besides technology, which is I think is fundamentally luck. That he was able to get on the ship, become an assistant. But yeah, Darwin definitely provided a really interesting view because, for example, during like after the it's kind of during the Spanish Inquisition, but near the end of it, when we reached the Enlightenment, when we were kind of moving away from religious thinking, and when Kant proposed the idea that we could be kind to one another without the need to have religion in place. I think that we really began to see another spark of innovations, but obviously the Enlightenment is one of those biggest moments of innovation within humanity that people can recognize. So I think really we begin to see that innovation has occurred at certain pillars, like certain events in history. And I think that the moments when we begin to reach a level where we can sustain ourselves, a level where we can be kind, where we can support each other, is a moment when we begin to advance upon what's currently broken, because we feel supported, we feel stable, and we can begin to advance on what the problems are, and we can move from there. So I think that's a really interesting idea. But that's really something I've kind of been thinking about a lot, because I think technology, especially those moments, have been really critical.
Yeah. What's your opinion on technology in the coming century? Right, like obviously we have a bunch of emerging technologies. You have AI, blockchain, IoT, etc., etc. Like, how do you think it matches up with, I guess, the technological revolutions of the 1900s? Right? Because in the span of 100 years, we saw personal computing, we saw rocket ships, right? And we saw, like, at least a dozen other, like, life-changing inventions. Whereas in the 2000s, like, certainly innovation has obviously been amazing. Like, you have phones and things like that. I don't know. Do you think that it's, like, compares to the past, or where do you think we're headed?
So technology is so early, like not technology specifically, but computers, something that we've been using for example, like lots of people who are around the age of around our age, computers, phones, this type of technology seems like it's been here forever, because that's what it's been for us. We've, since birth, I think I got my first computer when I was like, I don't know, 8 or 9. So like I've had technology surrounding me for a long time now. Yeah. And the truth is, if you look a little bit back, like 30, 40 years, like for example, somebody like my dad, who's around 56 now, he looks at technology as something that's relatively new. And that's surprising, because for me, it's like always been here. But I guess we're so early stage in technology in general, like in the computer space, because technology has so many definitions. Sure. If I refer to technology, I'm more referring to the most recent modern technology, but modern technology has only been around for very recent times. So I mean, in terms of where it's going in the next century, I mean, we're just going to continue to advance upon the problems that we see in the world. We're going to simplify. I've kind of this slogan when it comes to startups. It's not so a slogan, but like more of a mindset that the most critical things to consumers are their health, their money, and their time, because it's scarce, right? Consumers value scarce resources to a much higher degree than items that aren't scarce. So people will begin to innovate upon the scarcity. So, for example, health will begin to improve upon vaccinations, will begin to improve upon the critical things that can alter or damage your potential health. We'll find ways to simplify or reduce the amount of time it takes to complete certain tasks, or potentially even expand a lifetime by also affecting health. So health and time work together there as well. But money is something that we're seeing is already being innovated upon today. We're seeing a decentralized system with cryptocurrency. And with the decentralized system, we're seeing a new form of processes that are proposed by not a government, not a big central body, but by individuals who feel that they should be in power of their resources that they've worked for, that they feel like they've earned. So I think that is a new innovation that we're already seeing today. So I honestly, if you were to ask me that question, I would say that we're going to begin to see innovations upon health, time, and money within the next century. But specifically what it will be, I mean, we're so early that I can only explain that, or I can only assume that it would be innovations upon where we are today. So, for example, blockchain technology, most people, when they observe the blockchain, they just see crypto. And look, I'm in crypto, so for me, I don't want that industry to go away quite yet. But I mean, for example, cryptocurrency is just so early. It doesn't necessarily need to be even the main defining member of what blockchain technology is capable of. There's so much room, and we're seeing that now. We're seeing information stored on the blockchain. We're seeing hospitals. We're seeing governments using the blockchain to store data more securely. Yeah. So I really believe that we're going to begin to harness the technology we have around us to a significantly higher degree. And I think that's really what the future holds for us in terms of where technology is going, and where technology has the potential to become. Because I think that's all of it is going to rely on humans to be forefronting that, to humans to really getting more humans computers, getting more humans devices, more education, because that will allow people to truly understand and truly build upon the current technology we have today. And one thing which I think is super critical is teaching how to code. So for me, a quick brief story. I hate coding. I've always kind of been the soft skilled type of guy. But with my current startups, I'm doing 2 startups right now. With my current startups, I don't have the opportunity to just throw down like 15 G's and be like, you know what, hire some software developer and build it for me, because, you know, getting angel or venture capital investment before you even have a working product is an entrepreneur's it's a dream, but it's not necessarily that possible. So I've had to teach myself how to do front end and back end development, and although sometimes it's very challenging because, you know, sometimes you want to quit, it's really taught me and it's really showed me how I can use the education I have to innovate upon computers, this technology. And it's a really fascinating process that I feel proud every time I make this little small button on my HTML page. I'm like so proud of it, but in a big scope, it has no difference and no impact on society. But I think that it does allow us to understand how we as individuals can impact and begin to advance upon the technology that we have in a really interesting way.
Yeah, coding is almost like a testament to what's possible in a way, right? Like it's like you have the ability to build something, which is just crazy. Like it doesn't seem that significant, as you were saying, with like the HTML button, but it's like you're taking something that didn't exist and existed like purely in the confines of your mind, and you articulated it in some crazy format, right? You wrote it down with a series of lines and you brought it into existence, right? And I think if you look at coding that way, like bringing things that didn't exist into, like, you're creating something new. It's just insane how powerful that is. And it's only been around for like, what, 30 years at this point? 40 years?
Yeah, it really touches on the point that you discussed before, where it's like you really opening up those new doors, right? Because lots of people, like I was telling you before this podcast, that lots of people, like they always want to replicate things. Like they always want to, they look at people like Mark Zuckerberg, Bezos, you know, I just watched Bo Burnham special. So Jeffrey Bezos is still in my mind if you haven't heard that song yet. But Bezos, Musk, all these people, they feel the need to, like, they replicate the model because in school we're trained to replicate what works. We see, 1 + 1 = 2, but in the real world we necessarily, even in technology, we know that's not always the case. We know that 1 + 1 doesn't necessarily make 2 because it all depends on your situation. It depends on the timing. It depends on your team, your funding. It depends on so much. So a big problem that a lot of Gen Zs, a lot of new and interested students and entrepreneurs or even developers are making is they're just trying to copy things. And I mean, sure, you can copy code. I'm not saying necessarily copying code won't work, but I'm saying copying the code may not provide you the benefit or may not provide you the success that you're looking for, because you're not going to reach that new level, that new door that nobody's discovered yet because you haven't created that code yourself. So even like, I'll touch on this briefly because it's not really that close to technology, but for example, lots of founders really enjoy replicating the routines, replicating the thought processes of people like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, all these people. Even me, for a while back, I did a YouTube series of going into the routines of these specific people because I wanted to get my head in the same headspace. And I'm not saying their thinking doesn't work. Obviously, first principle thinking has been vastly beneficial for lots of people, and obviously for Descartes, the person who created first principle thinking, was highly successful, and so is Elon Musk. But I guess my position on this is that you have to kind of be your own individual. Like you have to find what truly works for you, and you have to kind of put aside what what specifically happened to other people, because that won't happen to you. You won't really find yourself in the exact situation that Elon Musk did, where you might find both your companies almost going into bankruptcy, but necessarily splitting the money and risking everything may not be the best choice for you. So even with technology, linking it back, replicating the technology won't necessarily help you in the long term. And I think really Peter Thiel, who is obviously the founder of PayPal, and now his data company, I always forget the name.
Palantir.
Right?
Yeah.
Palantir. Peter Thiel was, first of all, like I said, he's a really smart guy, but he himself in 0 to 1 really discusses the topic of really that vertical progress. You need to go from something that basically nobody's innovated upon. You need to recreate this entire industry. You need to completely advance it to a new level instead of creating that consistent horizontal progress, which would be replicating the code, or potentially even just creating a new startup within the same industry of another one doing the same thing, just marketing it differently. And one thing I think is very critical is really focusing on that vertical progress, because that vertical progress is what creates those defining moments, and you can't replicate those. The vertical progress is like, those moments of vertical progress are very, they're a joker. Not even a joker. They're like a 1 in a million. Like you can't replicate that, because it's very how would I define this? It's not very individual, but it's very fine in details. Like I don't even have a good word to even define this. Like it would be very hard or even impossible to replicate it. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I agree with what you're saying. I don't know if you've probably heard of Naval Ravikant, but for those of you guys who haven't, he's like an angel investor, he's like the philosopher of the tech community in a way, right? So he has this thread on how to get rich without getting lucky. And one of the things he mentions is that you need to find what society wants but doesn't yet know how to get, and then to deliver that very proposition at scale. And what's interesting is that by definition that can't be replicated. Because once one of society's needs has been fulfilled, and there's a company that's looking to fulfill that for a set amount of period of time, like maybe 10 or 20 years, you can't really do that again because it's already been, fulfilled, right? Like if you needed water and I gave you water, you can't have another company also giving you water because you already have it. It's a stupid example, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to go for. I think you kind of fill the slot, right? Like if somebody's already innovated and kind of reached that new vertical progress, you can't just come with your next company and be like, you know what, I'm going to get the same vertical progress because it's been done, right? So it's like a little puzzle piece slot. Like there's these, like if you imagine the world is almost like this long line, there's these little divots and they need to be filled. But it's almost like you have like a little invisible bridge that almost everybody walks over. Like they don't even notice these divots, right? Like they can't even observe them. But the people who just happen to notice this little divot and be like, oh shit, like this is a big problem, they are the ones who are capable of filling the divot with their puzzle piece, their startup, whatever they're doing. But that divot's closed. You can't get back into that. You might be able to push your way into it, but at the end of the day, that vertical progress has already been achieved. So I think you definitely explained it there. But that's I think is that really critical divot moment.
Yeah. Speaking of which, what gap or divot does Ordy fill? Like, I guess just for the last year, I think you've been working on Ordy. It's been super amazing journey, like just seeing you like progress and get investors, build your deck and everything. So yeah, like what's it about and how's it going?
Yeah, so currently, if people are interested, I'm working on Ordy, which is the website's MEET, Ordy.com, so meetordy.com. And I'm also working on something called 1KYC, which is something completely different. But Ordy itself, the divot I attempted to solve, which I'm still attempting, I'm not quite there yet, is really addressing the problem that investors aren't supported, especially new investors aren't supported when they try to invest in cryptocurrency. So lots of these investors, when they get into cryptocurrency, they're basically just thrown into Coinbase, they're thrown into Binance, they're thrown into one of the major exchanging platforms. And when that occurs, they're kind of just left sitting there on their ass clueless. What the hell do I invest in? Like, for example, my dad came up to me the other day with his Binance wallet. He's like, Jake, I have like 5 million NFT tokens. And I had to sit there for him for 10 minutes explaining that an NFT token is not a non-fungible token, like the artwork you see on Rarible or any of these websites. So there is education platforms. Obviously, there's financial literacy platforms, but there isn't a single platform that actually assists real time when people are trying to make an investment decision, and providing them with the proper advice, which could be the market price, the volume of people trading, or even potentially something much more difficult to measure, which would be like the positive opinion of a token, or if it's negative opinion, which is obviously AI sentiment. But I think with Ordy, the major thing I was really trying to address is providing investors with the proper support they need whenever they're making a decision. And I actually got my inspiration from an application called Clio. So Clio is a banking platform, which basically helps you save money. And it's an AI assistant where it basically says, oh, do I have money for this? Do I have money for that? Can you make this? Can I make a budget for this? Yada, yada, yada. And I really enjoyed the model because what it really showed me is something really human, something that you can kind of create that people feel okay talking to, because people don't necessarily like to get advice from Reddit. They take the advice, but it's not necessarily good advice. It's not personalized. It's not necessarily fitting to their exact needs. So if you create a AI assistant that analyzes how you invest and how you can invest better, providing you with rewards on building better habits, as well as giving you proper information to properly invest in certain cryptocurrencies, because every cryptocurrency is vastly different, you can end up at a point where you feel much more supported when you begin to invest in cryptocurrency. So that's really the genuine vertical progress behind Ordy.
Wow. Yeah, I definitely see that like taking off, especially like my personal story on this is that I had tried investing in cryptocurrency. Like I haven't done investments like with real money yet, mainly because I'm broke. But the point is that I basically tried like doing what you were saying with like Coinbase and Binance and everything. And it was just really overwhelming. Like you just look at all of these like hundreds and hundreds of cryptocurrencies, different ways to invest, etc. And it's just like, it's crazy, especially for someone who's just coming in, who's never invested before. Hearing about this thing called Bitcoin, and then going like, okay, wait, is Bitcoin cryptocurrency? Are all cryptocurrencies Bitcoin? Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Lots of people have a lot of trouble getting into the space, and actually, there's a lot of, interestingly enough, lots of skeptics of the space. So lots of the older population. I feel like boomers is still kind of derogatory, but the boomers or even the Gen X's who were pretty skeptical of cryptocurrency have actually been really filling the space quite quickly. My dad being one of those people who was very much against ever investing in cryptocurrency, and now probably owns a portfolio that's probably pretty hefty. So I mean, in terms of like innovation, in terms of getting into the space, lots of people are experiencing the same thing as you, and it's not abnormal. That's why Coinbase and lots of these other platforms offer cryptocurrency to learn. But the problem is, lots of people just want to trade. Most people don't just love to sit down and like sit behind a book and read. They're like, oh, I did that enough in school. So they kind of just want to get their hands dirty, like you did. You said you didn't have enough money to get real funds, so you want to get your hands dirty. You want to try out investing in cryptocurrency, but you didn't really have the proper. You didn't have the proper, not advice necessarily, but the proper knowledge on how to do that. So having almost, I call Ordy somewhat of an AI financial advisor, somebody who can be there at your helm, basically directing you, providing you with the proper information, saying like, oh, Elon Musk just tweeted about this, and since Elon tweeted about this, Doge has gone 242%. Like if you weren't on Twitter or you weren't watching the market that exact minute, you would have never seen that. So providing that critical advice at a critical moment and really supporting you is something that I've been really trying to do throughout the last year. And with Ordy, in terms of progress, Ordy's faced a lot of pivots, a lot of evolution. So Ordy, for example, it started off as actually a payment solution. So Ordy was called OrdCoin, which was sort of simplified to Ordy just because it sounded nicer in my head. But OrdCoin essentially was going to be the first payment solution for cryptocurrency in Canada. We actually worked briefly with MasterCard on a solution, and we were already talking with a few banks and a few other companies interested in working and using our solution. And the problem with OrdCoin was the popularity and the growth of companies like MCO Visa. So MCO Visa is actually created by Crypto.com, as well as the new Binance card and Coinbase card, which would vastly push us out of the market. And they offered international support. So I was working on that. I was like, you know what? It's a cool idea, but at the end of the day, I think there's a lot more potential in actually just supporting the investor. So I actually moved towards this was like probably around like 7 months ago. I moved towards a smart wallet approach. So basically a wallet that provided like risk analysis or recommendations for investing, which is very similar to the model we are at today, I kind of said, yeah, you know what, that model is good, but I can amplify it. I can add to it by doing an AI assistant, and that's kind of where we landed at today. But even with the AI assistant, you still face a bit of problems. For example, people don't like talking to a financial advisor. People, lots of millennials and lots of Gen Zs, and people like Alexis Ohanian, one of the founders of Reddit, are very proud and very prominent people discussing the fact that financial advisors are pretty much ripoffs. Like, they don't really support you. So one thing is, now that I'm trying to take the AI that I really built for my financial advisor, like the artificial intelligence assistant, and I'm really trying to position that into a wallet, so that way you still get the assistant, but in a way where it doesn't feel like it's forced, in a way where you can kind of be like, oh, I have the proper information I need, I have the proper understanding, and now I can make my own investment decisions instead of having some random artificial intelligence control my entire portfolio, which most people are kind of uncomfortable with, because we already see that with crypto bots. Like, for example, Crypto Hopper, as well as a few other crypto bots, aren't sufficient for long-term or even short-term investors. They provide good help and good support, but in crypto bots have been shown to potentially even create losses. So nothing secured, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, selling directly to consumers, like, in a way, is, I guess, a better way to impact the industry. Because it's kind of like what we were talking about with the nuclear energy project, right? Like, for those of you guys who don't know, nuclear energy is like, you split an atom, and then once you split that atom, the idea is that it generates heat, which heats water. Then the water basically gets turned into steam. That steam turns a turbine, finally generates electricity, right? So it's this long and winding process where the initial energy is like wasted. It's like, well, I think they're only like 50% efficient, right? And that's kind of like the same. I might seem like really weird for relating nuclear energy to business, but what was going through my head as I was listening to Jake was that you're basically saying that when you are going to consumer, it's almost like getting rid of that middleman, right? Like, 100% of the input energy gets converted, not necessarily 100%, but most of it gets converted into output in form of actual innovation. Whereas if you're doing like business to business to business to consumer, that's like more middleman, less efficiency in a way.
Well, it really depends on the type of technology you're building upon. There's definitely some businesses that provide a lot of impact to, or some startups that provide a lot of impact to businesses, to the government. But yeah, definitely talking and working with consumers directly can alter a landscape, can alter an industry, can alter the world to a much quicker degree, because at the end of the day, consumers are really what drives the world. Without consumers, we wouldn't have a functioning economy, we wouldn't have people demanding scarce resources, we wouldn't really have the need to innovate. So really targeting consumers directly, obviously depending on your model, is something that's very, very interesting, because it allows you to kind of get an understanding of the world, the problems, and really begin to innovate upon that. And in fact, one thing I can mention, which might be helpful to people who are in the startup realm, is the process that I typically look at when I'm trying to discover a solution for a certain problem directed at consumers, which I call it the forms. It's actually a concept discovered by Plato, which Plato, obviously being an ancient philosopher, he basically discussed this concept of the forms. So we basically look at the most ideal form of a scenario. For example, the most innovative, or the most the farthest reaching form of a technology. For example, like if you look at space travel, you could say, look, space travel right now, there's a lot of problems. We can't get that far, we can't go that quick, like we can't really go to the far reaching areas of space just because of our technology. So by looking at the form of space travel, we can see what is the most ideal form of space travel. Like, what would be the most ideal technology, the most ideal vision of what space travel is. And if you can look at the most ideal version and our relative, or the one that we have currently, you can begin to see the gaps or potentially small little issues that we can begin to address to get to that ideal vision that we want to get to. So that's just a really interesting thing that I also do a lot with cryptocurrency. So for example, I'll look at an industry like crypto and I'll say, look, what's the most ideal form of cryptocurrency? And the most ideal form is that every investor feels confident. They feel like they have the proper knowledge, the proper information to make good investment decisions. And if you look at the most ideal form of the industry and where we are today, you can attest to the fact that you had no idea when you were coming into cryptocurrency what to invest in. Like you can see the problems and you can begin to work to little solutions. So we saw education was one of the solutions that Coinbase and a dozen other websites are working on. But we saw that did provide some support, but it didn't provide enough to get to a little bit closer to that vision. So what you have to also look at is other solutions as well. So what else could work? And you can look at potentially real-time information, a financial advisor. You can look at a dozen other solutions that could potentially get you there. And what I'm working on is just potentially one of those solutions. So that's just something really interesting. And it also works a lot with technology because you can really look at the most ideal form of something and understand where vertical growth or vertical progress can come into play. But obviously, the most ideal form in many scenarios has to be somewhat grounded, considering the fact that we don't live in a fantasy world. So like the most ideal form of transportation may be teleportation, but if it's practical is a little challenging because completely unarranging your atoms and completely putting them back together, which would be required for teleportation, would be quite a challenging feat. So we're not quite there yet, but I mean there's definitely some forms of transportation that are way more ideal than where we are today.
Yeah, I think that's it's really interesting because that idea ties into our original concept of vertical progress, right? Essentially like the ideal, like maybe the 0 to 100 and then breaking that down into like little increments, 0 to 1, 0 to 2, 0 to 3, DC. Yeah, it's really interesting. And speaking of which, like, what are some key lessons that you've learned from these endeavors? Like, obviously, I think it's been almost a year now since Ordy, or I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, like, what are some of the obstacles and challenges that you faced, and how did you overcome them? Because, as someone who is looking to go into the startup world myself, like, it's obviously incredibly difficult. Like, it's not really a cakewalk.
So I think it really depends on who you are. Everyone's going to face different challenges along the way. For me, starting even at TKS, starting at the beginning with startups and everything, I felt like I deserved to be successful. Like I deserve to get a win, deserve to get a client. And you can't feel that way because you don't deserve to get any. If you feel like you're going to deserve it, like you feel like I'm just going to get it, you're never going to work hard enough to actually get the client, to get the job, to get anything, to get success with your startup. So some major lessons I've learned along the way is really to put stuff in a practical view. So like understanding the fact that, like I said, you don't deserve to be successful. You really have to work for that. And also really understanding what works well for you as well as what makes you happy. One thing I was trying to do a lot, especially like around a few months ago, was toxic startup culture, which is basically working. Like I think one day I probably worked 20 hours, like full 20 hours and only slept for 4 hours. And another day, actually a few weeks ago, which is probably not that great, I actually realized I was actually awake for a full 24 hours and I didn't even notice the fact. Like I was awake from 5 a.m. till 5 a.m. the next day. So, I mean, you really have to find what works well for you, and that just takes time. You need to find the environment. Like for example, for me, I really like to work in cafes. I don't even necessarily like to listen to the cafe. I just like to see people around me. It just provides a good sense of like not being a loner in my room all the time. Besides that, also making yourself happy, like working on projects that you feel provide you happiness. Because I've experienced in being an entrepreneur. First of all, being a teenage entrepreneur is vastly harder than being an older one because you're not necessarily doubted a lot more, but you have a little bit less support than those who are a little bit older. But for example, I've had mental health issues being an entrepreneur, feeling like I'm not successful, feeling like I may never be successful, or having the anxiety that I may not get investment money, or that my pitch deck wouldn't get seen, or it wouldn't go good. There's so many things that can occur that you really need to feel very happy with what you're doing. You need to feel like what you're doing has proper meaning and that it has enough value to you for you to sustain yourself and continue to do it, because honestly, it's hard. It's a lot harder than I ever assumed it would be. Like when I first viewed the startup world, I thought, oh, you know what? It'll be like a cakewalk. It'll be like, oh, I'm gonna walk in, eat some vanilla cake, go from one startup to the next one, sell some cake, Like it felt like it was gonna be this very easy story. Like I was just gonna, work for 1 year, work for 2 years, sell my first company for $50 billion, get on Forbes, get on all these shows, But it doesn't work like that. Like, even now, I was talking to Aditya before, but like I'm saying, you don't really deserve anything. You don't even deserve recognition. Although the modern form of recognition is highly skewed by followers and likes. I've never been on a podcast until today. Like, this is my first podcast, and people may say, no shit, this kid's an idiot, or they may say, oh wow, really? But I'm saying, like my point is, like, you don't necessarily deserve anything in the startup world, and you're just gonna have to work for every single thing, whether that be for investment money, whether that be for your product. And the one thing I can tell you is, I've had a co-founder, and I've not had a co-founder. Aleem was my co-founder. Yeah, I'm sure you know Aleem indeed, yeah. But Aleem was my prior co-founder, and honestly, having a co-founder or not having a co-founder is a big thing for a lot of founders because of the founder's dilemma. Some people think they can do it all on their own. They think they can do it all by themselves. And I was a preacher in the fact that you can't do it all by yourself. But now, looking back on it, I've done a lot of it by myself with not having the proper knowledge. Although you do miss the support, obviously you have the support of another person with you on your team who can keep you going. You do have the ability to kind of take it wherever your mind wants to take it. Because one thing I have a problem with, I think it's probably my Myers-Briggs personality type, my INTP, or just who I am as a person, as a bit of an introvert. But I typically just like to kind of I'm not somebody who really likes to be held down a lot by like a single idea, by a friend, by anything. So I kind of just take whatever I have and just consistently kind of move it around to the way I like it. But you can't, with a startup, it's a little challenging to do that because you can't just be like, oh, you know what, I'm going to build this one solution, but next month I'm going to build something entirely different. Like, you know what, you go from building out a restaurant, like you're like, oh, you know what, I want to build out a franchise to like building out a food truck. It's like something completely different, right? It's different, like it's different processes, it's different expenses. So, I mean, you kind of have to you have to look at a little bit of pivots. You have to kind of ensure that what you're doing has value. But the last piece of advice I can give is really on the terms of value, if providing significance, is talking to customers. Most of the times, lots of early stage founders like to kind of be like, you know what, I know what I'm doing, I have knowledge in the industry. But at the end of the day, like I said, consumers are the most critical part in an economy because if you're selling to consumers, they're the ones who are going to pay you. And I mean, not that money is what you're necessarily looking for. For me, for example, I'm looking for impact. You need money to act as a lifeblood. You need to sustain your company so it can impact people in the long term, not just necessarily like for 5 days. Like it's not like a Mr. Beast corporation or anything. But I mean, you need to talk to consumers as much as possible. For those who don't know, there's a Y Combinator founder who created the Mom Test. Very, very good book discussing about how to ask for impartial and unbiased advice about a startup, which is a really interesting method of doing it. But besides that, I said last piece of advice before, but just really start. Aditya, you said you wanted to be a founder. I know you're already doing crazy stuff, like this podcast, for example, but really just getting your hands dirty in the space, even if it's something small, something insignificant that you don't think is that crazy, just go ahead. That's what I'm doing right now with my new startup. It's nothing that I don't think is going to make me billions or quadrillions of dollars or help millions or billions of people, but I think it's just going to provide some support to people who do need it, and I think that's what's important to me.
Yeah, those are really valuable lessons. Like, it's almost, I think Elon Musk has this quote about starting a startup, which is, it's something about like eating glass and staring into the abyss.
Starting a startup is like eating glass and staring into an abyss, because the way I look at that is the fact that you're almost giving yourself pain, like you're like forcing yourself to eat the pain, and you don't know when it's gonna end. You're like, what the hell is happening here? You're just looking down a rabbit hole because you don't know when the pain's going to stop, because there's just a little transition period that occurs for a lot of startups, which is when they go from working their ass off to even get like a single customer to like blooming and getting millions or thousands of customers. And that happened with Superhuman. I'm sure you're familiar with the email. I don't know if you are the software Superhuman, but the application went from it was like 5 years in development, and they got no customers because nobody wanted to use it. And then they did this market. It was actually product validation, where basically what they said is really interesting for people who don't know this. But I think it's his last name is Vara. I don't remember his first name. Rahul Vora is the founder of Superhuman. He basically did this test where he talked to his customers, or the people who are using Superhuman. And he said, how sad would you be if you can no longer use Superhuman? And they realized that if that indicator is above 50%, if you would be so sad that you can't use Superhuman anymore, if that was above 50%, then you have good product validation. What you're doing is significant enough where you can have customers for the long term. And they've actually done these calculations for other startups. And it's a really interesting thing to look at, especially for those people who are struggling with product validation, because lots of times you build out this incredible product. You're like, your mom loves it, your cousin loves it, your brother's sitting there laughing, he's clapping his hands, and everyone in your family's like, oh, congrats, you did this muscle tov. And then you sell it to one consumer and they look at you saying, what the hell is this? This provides me no benefit in the slightest. So, I mean, that outside opinion is critical, and really that validation, again, talking to consumers and realizing how significant it is to them will really determine the lifetime value, so the amount of money you can make off a customer, and also how long you'll have that customer and if they'll churn or if they'll leave your company eventually.
Yeah, seeking perspective, man, it's easily one of the most critical aspects, like not even for building a startup, I think it's for anything really, right? Like especially with like I remember for the United Nations TKS challenge that we were doing, where we had to consult for the United Nations, as I said earlier. Okay, wait, I should probably have not said United Nations challenge where we consulted for the United Nations. Not the point. But the TLDR is that we were basically TLDR is that we were contacting government officials and everything like that, and the story we got from them was a little bit like, it wasn't too off, but it was significant enough that we had to essentially like revamp parts of our solution because it was different. Like what the scientific literature and things were saying, like they were accurate statistically, but the on the ground realities and the perspective of the individuals who are actually facing the problem is something completely different.
Yeah, I don't want to go too much on the government, but even if you look at governments like Haiti right now, or if you look at Madagascar, where they just were like one Frenchman and a few other people just tried to assassinate the Madagascar president, or even what's happening in Haiti, where they arrested the president because they asked him about corruption and he refused to tell them. Lots of stuff in terms of political situations are typically construed because people don't feel or people don't openly discuss topics like corruption or bribery or any of these negative topics, because it shines a negative light towards their nation and can alter relationships with other nations. But that's vastly off the topic of what we're talking about. But I mean, politics is a very interesting thing. There's actually this I'll talk about this briefly, but there's this is a new show on Netflix. I don't know if they have it in Canada. I'm still away, but there's this show on Netflix, and it's called How to Become a Dictator? It's How to Become something like that. It's like something very, very harsh. And I was like, you know what? Like, why not just give it an episode? And it's like a full play. They walk you through a playbook of how to position yourself like Hitler. Like how to get into the position of somebody like Hitler or Mussolini or Ida Amin or like any of these authoritarian people. And it's really fascinating because you can see how they kind of got into that position, and how it's not like they openly were talking like, oh, I'm going to kill all these people, I'm going to do all of this. But what they do is they almost try to go into the same group as other people. Like they try and fit in to the major problem and try to agree with people. So like, for example, I think it was with Hitler, where after there was like this massive attack on something, and he started blaming the Soviets. Like he like the next day, the Nazi Party like printed like thousands of flyers saying the Soviets did this. It was like the burning of the president building. That's what it was. It's the burning of the president building. And the theory is that Nazis burned the president building, not the Soviets. The Nazis burned it. And Hitler, obviously being the leader of the Nazis, was behind the whole thing. But he just staged it so that way he could begin to agree with the people. And all these people are saying, oh, the Soviets did it. And he gets up on stage and he goes, yeah, the Soviets did it. And now all these people are agreeing with him. It's just this really interesting thing. It's not that relative to what we were talking about before. But I think it's really interesting how influence becomes or gets into place, and how even with technology, if you begin to innovate upon the same landscapes as other people and you begin to work with consumers directly, you begin to kind of get, it's a bad expression, but get in bed, like not bribing people, but get closer to consumers. It's an expression. If you get closer to consumers, you really begin to see like the major problems, and you can begin to kind of innovate upon those. Hopefully that those kind of were analogize this, but maybe not. But I think it's just an interesting TV show to bring up.
But that actually makes sense. Like, I don't know if you've heard of this guy. His name's Jordan Peterson, right? He's like a clinical psychologist.
Yeah.
So he has this. Pardon?
He's a professor at the University of Toronto.
Yeah, I think he left his professing career, but that's not the point. So I think he was he studied totalitarian regimes and things like that, right? And he brings up 2 points which I think relate a lot to startups and innovation. One of them is that totalitarianism is not necessarily like the idea of being authoritarian, but the idea that you know everything, right? Like totalitarianism. Like, you know everything there is to be known and you cannot like know more, right? And he also brings up the second point he brings up is that these regimes were essentially founded not on these like huge lies, but the compounding of small lies over time that the government told to the public and the public willingly accepted, despite knowing that, hey, okay, this probably isn't true, right? And eventually the scope of those lies grows to such a huge extent that you can't really, that the cost of telling the truth is larger than just going with a lie, right? And I think that relates to startups because one thing we were mentioning is seeking perspective, right? Like, someone who essentially doesn't seek perspective is in a way saying that they have all the information needed, right? And like, they're a totalitarian, like they know all there is to be known in total, right? And essentially it's like, that's obviously a lie because there is legitimately an infinite amount of knowledge in the universe, right? And it's never a case where you can know everything. And that's why totalitarian regimes often fail. So it's interesting because in startups, like, I think the way that they can fail as well is that if the founders and if the employees are telling lies to themselves about maybe the company's business, the true like extent of the problems that the consumers are facing and how the startup is actually addressing them, or the quality of the product, as you were mentioning with the mom test, which helps combat that. So yeah, it's just an interesting thought you brought up there.
Yeah, the worst case scenario of that is when you dig yourself into such a massive hole where you're like, oh, this product is going to work so good, but the problem becomes the fact that you spent $100,000 of investors' money and you have a product that is shit. And I think this actually happened to Alexis Ohanian, which is one of the Reddit founders. I think it was him and a team. It might be him or it might be another team, but they're definitely Y Combinator founders. And what they did is they built this whole platform where basically they wanted to make the schooling test environment like more interactive so that students could be like more supported. And what happens is they went to all the schools, and because of Y Combinator and because they went to like Stanford and all these good schools, they were able to get all their technology in all these incredible schools. But what they did is they gave it to the schools. The teacher says, okay, I'll do it for one lecture. They sat in the back of the room watching, and they realized nobody gave a shit. They were all just watching their YouTube videos. They were all just on social media because they dug themselves into this massive hole, spent like $50,000-$60,000 on this technology to develop this one thing. And they told themselves like they thought they were like this all-knowing figure where they're like, oh yeah, you know what? This is going to work. We already know. But it didn't. So what happened is they went back to Y Combinator. They talked with Michael Siebel. I think they talked with Paul Graham, actually. Yeah. Michael Siebel wasn't at Y Combinator then. They talked with Paul Graham. And Paul was like, you know what? Just, you guys should build the front page of the internet, like something people can use or something people can view. And that's Reddit, obviously. But it's really interesting because you're definitely right. I think that problem comes with a lot of ego. And one thing that was a big problem for me coming into the startup world was that ego thinking, oh, you know what, I deserve this, I deserve to win, like what I'm building is good enough. But if you don't talk to people, if you don't get your ego shattered, if you don't start eating that glass a little bit, you'll get a little bit of the pain, you'll kind of continue down this path where you'll kind of observe what you're doing and be like, oh yeah, I'm good. I've already. It's basically like it's like sitting back in your chair after you wrote 4 lines of code and being like, you know what? I just made $50 billion off my acquisition. It's like you haven't finished the product yet. And you're like, you know what? I already know it's good. So talking with people, big problems. People aren't comfortable sharing their ideas. People think, oh, you know what? You know, this dude Aditya right here is going to steal my entire company idea. But the thing is, I was using your name as a joke. I don't think you'd ever steal my ideas. But people are always so wary of the fact that people are going to steal their ideas. But if you're always so cautious, you won't get the proper advice you need because you'll be telling people, you'll be like, oh, I have this incredible idea, but I can't tell you what it is. So I'm like, That's nice. How do I know it's an incredible idea? Like it's a big problem for a lot of Y Combinator founders. They put on their application, they go like, "We are reinventing the internet." That's like the first line on their Y Combinator application. They're like, "We are creating a database like Google." But what it does is it allows, like they go on and they explain it in this very broad sense. The most critical thing with startups is explaining what you can do in explain what you're doing in as least amount of words as possible. Like you should be able to explain what you're doing very quickly, because if you are in a very simple manner, then you're able to convey the value, the purpose, the meaning behind your startup to as many people as you need to. But if you're not able to even understand the own purpose, the own value and what you're doing with your startup, then how will anybody else in the world understand it? You can't expect that, right? Yeah. So, I mean, that's that. Focus on that critical aspect of the least amount of words as possible, because as long as you can simplify it to at least amount, like very short amount of word, like a short sentence, and at least have that make sense. You can't just be like, you can't just say we are reinventing the internet, because if Aditya came to me with this idea, the startup idea, and he goes, I'm going to reinvent education, I'm going to say, what's the idea? Like, you have to be able to convey the whole idea in at least one sentence, in my mind at least. But obviously, that'll differ who you're talking to.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense, though. Like, it's about explainability ultimately, right? Like, especially, like, I work in the data science field, and, like, I'm currently interning at a company, right? And one thing that I find is that it's really hard to convert insights or ideas, right, into easily manageable forms and articulate them into a way that people can understand it and then act upon it. Because, like, one of the jobs as maybe a CEO or a founder is essentially, like, creating this image that you have of the world that minimal or no one else has, and putting it in, reconstructing an accurate depiction of that image into the subconscious minds of other individuals so they actually know what the hell you're doing, right? And when you say things like, we're reinventing the internet, I mean, what does that mean? Are you like, I don't know, making a new browser? Yeah. Like, there's a million different things you can do. Like, that's probably the least accurate image. And I think it's probably one of the reasons why startups fail. Like, honestly, like lack of explainability and lack of perspective, like the two greatest pitfalls.
Yeah, for sure. The thing is, it's also copying models, right? Like, for example, for a big time in the startup world, lots of people would like go up to, you probably seen this joke on some social media, but they would go up to like an IT developer and say, can you make me like a Facebook for cats or Facebook for dogs? Like, they just want to replicate this proven model for an animal. And sure, it may work, but you're not going to see the same vertical progress as the initial company did, because, for example, Facebook completely reinvented social networks. Like, Facebook is known as the biggest social network, right? I think they have a few billion users on it. And, like, for example, platforms like YouTube and all these incredible social media platforms have allowed people to share and communicate to a much higher degree. It's created this vertical progress. But for lots of people, they just want to kind of they want to almost copy these models and kind of convey the same value, like the value Facebook has, but to a vastly different audience. And that's something that you can't do, because Facebook is something built on context. It was built for humans to connect, not necessarily dogs to connect. But yeah, for sure, lots of founders definitely have a lot of trouble conveying the purpose of their startup. And what they do is lots of founders will go, oh, we are the Facebook, but for dogs. Like, okay, that provides some better explanation. But the problem with that explanation is it's still super broad. Like, what aspect of Facebook are you trying to build? Are you telling me I can like search at my little doggy friend on Facebook and look at his timeline and be like, oh, he was born like two and a half doggy years ago? Like, it just doesn't provide a lot of understanding. So startups fail for a lot of major reasons. I think it's like 95% of startups fail within the first year. It's some crazy statistic. It's like very crazy statistic. So I mean, like, that was really surprising to me, especially when I began to start. But persevering is something I continuously look at. And for teenagers, people, I don't know who exactly your demographic is for this podcast, but people specifically who are under the age 20, they should be starting startups as soon as possible, because you have the lowest amount of risk. Because let's say you're 35, 40, and you're in a position where you have to create a startup, you are faced with potentially student debt, You are faced with mortgages. You're faced with feeding yourself, the caring for yourself, doing all the expenses. While if you're under 20, you're most likely living with your parents, who I'm not necessarily saying can still pay for your expenses, but I'm saying you're most likely in a better situation than you would be if you're trying to pour or siphon all your money directly into a startup, because you may just have to pay for your house or for your food.
Yeah.
So definitely major problems. People sometimes give up way too early. Lots of people they basically just have too many problems and they say, you know what, it's not worth it. And there is a time to give up, but it's definitely not when it's early. You just have to kind of move past problems, kind of talk with other people, get more perspective, because you may have dug yourself in a hole, but you never know. There could be some person who's walking by and can pull yourself out if you find the right person, obviously. And really, like I said, if you're really happy with your startup and you really see the meaning, and you normally when people ask me about startups, I ask them if they're experiencing the problem themselves, because if you're not, it's very challenging to find the purpose of working on a startup day and night. So if you really don't have that meaning or that purpose, you'll just give up very quickly. So this is the same for anything, not even for startups. I'm sure you've experienced it. If you don't see a purpose in the company you're working for, you'll be like, oh shit, like, okay, I don't really want to work on this anymore.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it reminds me of, I forgot what book it's from, but there's this quote, which is like, happy families are all the same, but it's the unhappy ones that are different. It goes something along the lines of that, right? And it's interesting because that's kind of the philosophy behind startups as well, like what we were talking about at the beginning and just now. The idea that all, I guess, successful entrepreneurial endeavors essentially have the thing in common that they're providing value and they're filling problems and they're innovating, going 0 to 1. And all the ones that have failed are all failing for different reasons, but each of them are things that you need to address to like get past that initial roadblock.
Yeah. There's a lot of startups that are around the space, and lots of families do have a lot of problems. If you look at the divorce rates, I think the divorce rates are like 50%.
Yeah.
It's crazy, right? It's like 50%. Like only half of only one half of couples actually succeed. There's a lot of issues around the startup space. And you know what? Another big issue is with co-founders. Like, for example, co-founders in many case scenarios, it's like a family. People like to call it a marriage, actually, because co-founders are so close to each other. It's a little messed up, but you have to be so in tune with your co-founder, because they're the ones who are at the other helm of your company, especially depending on how you kind of organize yourself. Most companies don't do 2 CEOs because it's pretty messed up. But what most companies will do is they'll do a CEO, CTO, or CEO, CMO. And you really need to rely and you really need to trust that co-founder to do his job, to do her job or their job properly to a good degree. Because if they're not, then you're lagging, like you have a tail, you have like a little thing that's dangling, so your little branch. So I think it's pretty critical to also focus on co-founders. But yeah, I think it's really interesting because with technology and with startups, it's always about finding the right people to talk to. Yeah. It's always about finding the proper perspective, because most of the times people kind of reach out, and sure, there might be a hand there to grab you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the hand there is good for support. And for example, one thing I've experienced a lot being a teenage founder is the lack of support from individuals who who are kind of outside of the innovation community I'm in. Like, for example, I have TKS, and obviously most of the kids in TKS support my message, what I'm working on, my mission, all the things that I'm really motivated by. But then I have my outside environment, which is my school. And at my school, there's lots of kids who are betting on me failing or betting on my downfall just because they feel the need to hate. They feel the need to actually not support because they're either jealous or they don't feel like they could do that themselves. So it's this really interesting contrast. And one thing a lot of new founders experience is a lack of support, whether that be from your family, your best friends, your community around you. And it's critical that you have that value, that purpose with your startup to really continue and really move beyond the lack of support, because you have to support yourself. That's something really critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of which, first of all, I'm definitely one of the people who are betting that your thing is going to succeed, 100% just seeing your work ethic and everything. But speaking of which, what are your, high-level goals for the future? Where do you see yourself in 10, 20 years maybe?
10, 20 years, man. Whoa. So that's a far timeline. I don't really try to put 10-year goals or 20 years goals, because one thing I've learned is whenever you try and create a routine, or whenever you try to create a plan, you constrict yourself into it. And most people say, oh yeah, I want to be constricted into like a specific routine. But the truth is, when you're that constricted, you don't allow yourself to have opportunities that may be beyond that set out plan. So in terms of where I want to be, the mission I've kind of been driven by is actually making people smile, like making people happy, like getting them to kind of at the end of the day kind of sit down and be like, you know what, I had a good day today. Also changing perspectives. Like lots of people out there are very set in stone about what they believe in. But if you can propose new perspectives and get new people to believe in them and feel inspired by them or feel motivated by them to do more good for humanity, that's something that I also am looking out for as well. So those are kind of the two major things I look for in terms of where I want to be. I mean, I want to be obviously still in the startup world. I want to be helping out with other founders, basically improving upon their startups, potentially investing if I can, and really working with those individuals. But I never want to play a passive role in my life. Like I never want to be on the sidelines just while my life kind of runs by me. So I'll most likely be in the startup world going until I die, because for me, retiring seems a little boring. And then also just like going around the world, like, you know, I like to believe that impact or change creates wealth, but even capitalizing upon that wealth and living this incredible life, I think that'd get vastly boring as well. I think there was a quote that the moment you stop learning is the moment you get old. So for me, I enjoy learning. So learning will be a primary cornerstone as well. But yeah, I mean, one thing I think is super critical for me, at least, is also staying on top of technology, consistently following it and never getting left behind with trends. Because I think that if you're at the forefront of everything, then you have the capability of discussing and proposing new opinions, which to me is something that I think is highly valuable. But beyond that, just other achievements that are pretty stupid, which are mostly like tangible achievements, which I think you could get or you couldn't get. But, you know, there's one thing I've actually talked with Evan about, who I think you've talked with before, which is actually moving a little bit more into the physics field as well. For me, I don't like math either. I don't like coding. I don't like math, but I do like physics. So potentially doing some stuff with quantum theory, potentially doing some subatomic stuff would be pretty interesting for me. But one thing I've always told myself is I'm never limiting myself to one plan. Like I said, I'm always going to be across industries, across different disciplines. So even opening a restaurant at some point is pretty interesting for me. Making some music. I'm not even joking. Like going everywhere. Because the truth is, we're only provided with one life. Like we are only given one chance. So if I don't do everything with this one life, then I feel like I'll be pretty disappointed at the end. Like I have a lot of high expectations for what I want to get done. So if I'm not capable of really trying a lot of things, I'm just not gonna be that happy. And it's I'll kind of end it on this question here. But Yes Theory, actually Thomas Bragg from Yes Theory basically discussed this concept of being tired when you're 80. Because most people, by the time they turn 80, they wake up and they're like, you know what, I'm gonna do stuff now. It's like you know, when you kind of don't do a lot in a day, like if you just kind of lay around the entire day, at the end of the day you feel like this random motivation to get shit done, because you're like, you know what, I haven't done anything yet, I just want to get it done. Like I want to do some shit because I want to feel productive. It's the same thing. You spend your whole life kind of sleep, like in sleep mode, and you're passive, you're not even an active player, and you end up, by the time you're 80, at the end of your day, or at the end of your life rather, you feel this random motivation. You just feel like, you know what, now's the time to do it. But the truth is, when you're 80, you can't do that much. You can do a lot, but you don't have the opportunity to do as much as you could when you were younger. So really getting super tired while you're 80, but you just want to be done. By the time you're 80, you just kind of you want to be able to rest. You want to be able to kind of live the rest of your life, like learning, understanding, helping others. But you should really try to accomplish most of the stuff before you're 80. I think that's kind of what I'm really aiming for. But at the end of the day, who knows how far lifespan may end up with new advancements in health technology. So who knows? Maybe it'll be 180 by the time I reach 40. So we'll see what TKS kids are up to, because I think some TKS kids are working on some cool solutions. You know what? In Dubai, actually, where I am right now, they actually were able to make it rain yesterday artificially.
Wow.
They put drones in the air to kind of measure the clouds, and then they shocked the clouds and they made it rain in Dubai yesterday. So I mean, where technology is going is pretty fascinating, and I think there's a lot of potential to make a lot more advancements. And honestly, I think that we should really be promoting a lot more individualized thinking. So getting kids thinking outside of school to a much higher degree, getting them interested in topics, getting them pursuing their paths as soon as possible. In Italy, for example, the schools there, they do it by discipline. Like you go to school for what you want to do, like high school. It's like you go to high school, for example, for cooking, or you go for high school for technology. It's like they actually separate it into a different category. So, for example, if you want to become a chef, you don't have to learn bullshit algebra. Like that it shouldn't be relevant if you like. I don't think any chef is trying to do Pythagorean theorem when they're in the kitchen, like deciding how many meatballs they should make. But I mean, like the critical thing is really focusing and really finding what you love to do as early as possible. There's one kid in TKS, I don't know, he might be an innovator, he might be in the foundations program, who's 9. I forget his name, but he's 9 years old, and I think he's a 3-time TEDx speaker. Like, not even a lie. Crazy kid. He's in TKS, and he's also, like, he speaks at, like, all these conferences. He has all these projects. He's doing all these incredible things. He's 9. Just for reference, for viewers out there, he's a 9-year-old kid. So, I mean, if you kind of look at where you are now, I'm not saying if you're old, doesn't necessarily mean you can't start now, but I'm saying you should begin to try and start as young as you potentially can, because it'll only provide you with more benefit. And I saw this TikTok or maybe Instagram thing the other day. And it was basically like, I don't do things that 23-year-olds do, because I like, he was like a 23-year-old, but he's like, I started doing 23-year-old things when I was 16. So by the time I'm 23 or by the time I'm 26, I'm going to be doing things that 30-year-olds do. And it's like, it goes on and on and on. So you get this everlasting advantage. And there's this one quote I read a long time ago, and it's like, I think it was I'm paraphrasing it a little bit, but it was like, you have the biggest leap ahead. Like, you have the biggest chance of success if you just start earlier. If you started, you're already way ahead of everyone else. And I don't like to look at life as a competition, because I'd like to think that, first of all, everyone's equal, but I also like to think that everyone has the opportunity to impact and change the world whenever they are in life. But I do like to look at knowledge, and I do like to look at a difference in how you can create change over time. And one thing I see is that the kids who start younger have more potential to do that. So I think that's what TKS is motivating. That's what the Thiel Fellowship is motivating. That's even what On Deck, their new Catalyst program, is motivating as well. So starting young, getting going as quick as possible, and really, really focusing on projects that make you happy.
Absolutely. Yeah, like starting earlier, I think it comes down to the same basic philosophy, which is squeezing as much as you can of like the finite amount of time that we have. Because obviously, like, if you start early, I think the main logic behind that is that you just simply have more time. You have more, like, it's literally like saying that both someone who has maybe 10 grand in the bank and someone who has like 10 million are both investing into the same market, same returns. The person who's investing 10 million is going to have more returns regardless, just because they have that initial, I guess, reserve of scarce resources, in that case money. But I guess it's the same thing of time. And yeah, honestly, I think that's a perfect place to end off, which is, squeezing the most value of your days, because they eventually compound and make up like a lifetime, as you were mentioning. And it's amazing.
One thing I'll talk briefly, and we can just finish it there, is the fact that if you are young, if you are around me or Aditya's age, then you have time. Like, you do have the time to pursue a lot. So one thing I would focus and really be very clear upon is the fact that you aren't limited. You don't have like 5 hours left. You don't have a month left. Take your time and really enjoy what you're doing, because there's lots and lots of people who end up on their deathbeds, who end up dying, who regret the fact that they worked too hard, they didn't spend enough time with their family. So there's a lot of times that, especially as a teenager, especially as somebody who gets started as an entrepreneur, even for me, where I feel like, I should be at success by now. Like, I've been working hard, I should be there by now. But like I said, you don't deserve anything. Like, you really have to put in the work, and you really have to be happy and find fulfilling purpose with what you're doing. Just the one thing to be careful of is never pushing yourself to the position where you're like, I have, like, you're in the wrong mindset for time. Like, you're in this position where you kind of view the world as this like 10 minutes left, and you're like, I just haven't accomplished a lot, because at the end of the day you have so much time, and that's something that I think is pretty critical.
Absolutely. Yeah, think that's a good place to end off, man. Thanks so much for doing this.